Resident Evil 4 is arguably one of the most influential horror games there ever was and could easily be described as a masterpiece. But unfortunately, it was arguably too good and pretty much ruined the horror game space for literally a decade. But let's start with a short history lesson so that we are all on the same page. After Resident Evil 1 started the trend of horror games with tank controls, fixed camera angles and limited resources in the year 1996, every publisher suddenly needed their own ultra scary better than Resident Evil Trust Me survival horror game, and soon the market was flooded with them. Capcom's several Resident Evils on the first PlayStation and GameCube, Dino Crisis, Konami's Silent Hill 1-4, Sega's Deep Fear, Fatal Frame, Alone in the Dark, Galarian's Haunting Ground, Fear Effect, Parasite Eve, Siren, Hell Knight, even f***ing Evil Dead, Obscure, and probably like a million more. Survival horror games absolutely dominated the horror game space in the late 90s and early 2000s, but unsurprisingly, rather sooner than later, a fatigue started to creep in and those games started to get stale, especially to the mainstream audience, and sales declined even though various installments from that time, like the Resident Evil 1 remake and Silent Hill 2, were critically acclaimed. It was clear, a change, or more so a revolution, was needed and Capcom was well aware of that, which is why the game titled Resident Evil 4 was set to go in a vastly different direction. Fast forward to 2005, Resident Evil 4 finally released after going through multiple different versions, and it completely reinvented not only the Resident Evil franchise, but the entire gaming space. The innovative over-the-shoulder camera, smart enemy AI, tense QTEs, and action-packed gameplay with resource-dropping enemies were never seen before in such a well-done combination and was much more appealing to the mainstream, since it had almost nothing to do with the survival horror releases of the previous years. The horror took a step back and the game was less tense than its predecessors, excluding some short segments. There was no more resource management in the classical sense, fixed camera angles were replaced, and linear paths were favored over backtracking and exploration. But damn was it brilliant nonetheless. It literally set a new template for games of almost all genres for the next decade. Just like with the first Resident Evil 9 years earlier, Capcom managed to perfect a formula they just invented. Obviously, everyone noticed the success of Resident Evil 4 and again, the next wave of copies and heavily inspired games followed. But this time the trend was even bigger and more extreme. Resident Evil's biggest rival, Silent Hill, turned towards much more action with the shift to Western developers and the releases of Homecoming and Downpour. Dead Space, as one of the biggest horror IPs during that time, was so similar that it was often titled Resident Evil 4 but in space. Shinji Mikami, the director and producer of several Resident Evil games, followed a similar formula with his then new IP The Evil Within. Alone in the Dark, ironically one of the big inspirations during the development of Resident Evil 1, turned to more action, and even Resident Evil itself went into a more extreme direction in Resident Evil 5 and 6, with even more action and mainstream appeal. Not to mention how most action games are copying the over-the-shoulder camera and QTEs till this day. If you can even call it copying anymore, considering it literally became a standard. Probably not. But anyway, something that isn't a standard yet is subscribing to my channel when you watch my videos, at least according to this YouTube analytics. So please do so if you're enjoying this one. Thank you. Unfortunately, many of the games I just listed were quite shit. And that's simply down to them not even understanding why Resident Evil 4 worked so damn well in the first place. This might come as a shock to some developers, but it's not as easy as just putting the quadruple amount of enemies into the game, streamlining every path, and having more kaboom. I mean, obviously Resident Evil 4 did that as well, but much more important was the fantastic balance of action, suspenseful horror, and stressful tension. For example, the moody ambient sounds and art direction in the beginning build up suspense. The famous village fight is incredibly action-packed and ramps up the tension once the Chainsaw Man shows up, and a bit later you get to the section after Del Lago with the reveal of the Las Plagas, all while growling thunder and pouring rain set the tone for a surprisingly scary segment. But in the meantime, you still have plenty of downtime in between with less stressful, fun action moments and interesting story beats. In my opinion, the castle and island later in the game don't work as well as the first third of the game in the village, but the whole game retains a great mix of fun action, tense action, and surprisingly scary horror. Other games that followed just ignored everything that made Resident Evil 4 fun and focused solely on prioritizing action and linearity, because apparently that's exactly what made Resident Evil 4 so successful in the eyes of certain game studios, and not that it's actually good. Anyway, as a result we got some of the games I mentioned previously, which were plagued by bad controls, the need for pointless and excessive action set pieces, and no understanding of why earlier games in the respective franchises were so good. Take Resident Evil 6 as an example. It has annoyingly complicated controls, no sense of proper pacing, and a new action set piece every 5 minutes. Or take Silent Hill Homecoming, aka Silent Hill the movie, the game. An unpolished mess featuring Pyramid Head, because why not, clunky combat, and more poorly done action. Everyone was so obsessed with chasing mainstream appeal that they seemingly forgot one tiny detail. Games still need to be fun. Luckily, not all was entirely bleak and shit and depressing, because some of the IPs I mentioned didn't suck, and those are Dead Space and The Evil Within, both heavily action oriented and fairly linear. However, in contrast to other seemingly similar games, these managed to be extremely enjoyable. They basically took what Resident Evil 4 did before, did that really well, and on top of that innovated further with their own ideas to create their own identity. They even had some proper horror, which was not only just there, but also very tense, and because that's not already enough, finally some good controls and fun combat. But to get back to our depressing video topic. Even though these games were much better than for example what Konami and Capcom delivered with Silent Hill and Resident Evil, these two were still action horror games at the end of the day. Despite being arguably the scariest horror games with the most resemblance to classic survival horror you could get from a bigger production, resource management was still more placebo than actual risk, exploration was limited to going slightly off path every now and then, and slow psychological terror was at best replaced by jump scares. Our return to proper survival horror was still entirely unimaginable during the early 2010s. So for virtually a decade, so-called horror games weren't really horror anymore, but apart from some exceptions, rather clunky action games with some blood and monsters thrown in. And that's also the reason why Resident Evil 4 ruined horror games for a decade. Even though it's just an incredibly good action horror title, it led others to believe that it's the right choice to abolish all that what gave them their identities in the first place, and therefore it indirectly caused a massive quality drop-off for most bigger horror productions for quite a long time. But by now, you might be wondering why I'm referring to a decade for the entirety of this video, when seemingly everything had gone to shit. And unsurprisingly, this is because there was a change. A change so great that we are now finally able to enjoy plenty of new, proper survival horror games. This change was Resident Evil 7 and especially the Resident Evil 2 remake. In a time where first-person indie horror games pretty much took over the genre of actually scary games in the early 2010s, Capcom released Resident Evil 6 and got a fairly negative response from basically everyone. This led them to finally change their approach for the following games. The motto was back to the roots, and they f***ing delivered. In 2017, just a bit more than a decade after Resident Evil 4 started the downfall, Resident Evil 7 was a huge success and showed that survival horror wasn't entirely dead and could still appeal to a large audience. Then the Resident Evil 2 remake followed and caused the whole remake trend that is still going strong with multiple exceptional releases every year. It's actually kinda ironic how it took Capcom themselves, the same company that made survival horror mainstream in the first place, just to accidentally ruin it with Resident Evil 4, to finally bring it back in all its glory with Resident Evil 7 and all that followed. At the end of the day, I'm quite glad how everything turned out though. Of course, this dark age of endless action horror games was grim to live through, but it came back stronger than ever, both in the indie and double and AAA space. And we can appreciate survival horror in a way we couldn't before. So in a certain, very weird way, Resident Evil 4 both saved and killed and saved horror at the same time. But what do you think about this topic? Please let me know in the comments. Apart from that, I would appreciate if you subscribe, like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much and see you next time!